So I'm just going to go through briefly the kind of the indicators that I've called out for you to look at in detail in the project brief, and just go through what's kind of required in each. So the first one is a site assessment. So there's 1 point available for doing a site assessment. So with you to look at this in detail, you'd need to go through and just put together a little couple of pages on these types of issues. So describe the topography of the site, which you should have from your OS surveys or OS maps, maybe some photos of the same thing, describing the topography. Hydrology is done in the same way as for HPI, where you're looking at the flood info information and just summarizing what's going on there. You might also find anything from your development plans. The climate needs to be very briefly summarized, so climatedata.org or climate consultant, that will give you some outputs for what the climate is generally like. A description of the vegetation, again this would come from the survey or your own knowledge of the site. The soils you may not have if you haven't done an in-depth survey, but you can look at, you can give a description of what you think, and that might be there. And again, that would be somewhere to highlight where it's you're making some assumptions, or where you're making assumptions, that you highlight them. And then human use, just in terms of what the site was used for in the past, the history of the site, if there's any kind of anything of note there. And then human health effects, things to do with noise pollution, air pollution, etc. Is there anything like that nearby? And also, is there any kind of amenities in terms of walkways, just to summarize what they are in that part. This is just another version of the same thing, so you can see that it can be done in a couple of different ways, where you basically give your evidence and then just do a little bit of commentary. Not much is required, and then you would get your LEED 1 point. The location and access to quality transit, again, is done in exactly the same way as the HPI. You need to or go onto the Google Maps, and you need to calculate the distances to the different amenities, or to the different public transport stops. There is, I suppose, the added bit here where you need to look at that's not what I wanted you to look at. I want to look at right now. Where you need to look at, sorry, the frequency of the routes and the frequency of directions and stuff. So a little bit of desktop research is needed just to see what is around there, to see if you can get the point under that. There's 4 available, to see how many you can get if you're getting any of that public transport requirements being met there. And again, depending if you're working in a city or if you've got a rural location, this will be either very quick to do, or it will involve a little bit more of research, depending on the amount of transport that is available to you. Then the surrounding density is done, and diverse uses is done in exactly the same way. You need to calculate your residential density to see what your points are, and your non-residential or your combined, whatever option you go for there. And then you also need to count the kind of type of diverse uses within the 800 meters and see if you can get any points there. So again, it's a counting, measuring kind of Google Maps exercise. So when it comes to the daylight, this again will be done. This technically is asking for dynamic simulation, but I'm not going to be asking you to do that. So the method, either using even using the HPI calculator to calculate the daylight factor, or using the VLUX tool. In fact, the VLUX tool might be more useful here because it looks at illuminance as well, is absolutely sufficient to do a typical room or typical space in your, or several typical spaces in your building project. And then these are the thresholds that you need to achieve in terms of daylight floor area and daylight factor. So you technically, I suppose, it is like it's a version of option 1, so you can go with that table. even though it's not as dynamic, it's not a dynamic simulation as such, but you can have a look through this as well for the different building types, what the percentage is that you can achieve or look at there. So then for quality views, you need to make sure that you've got a direct line of sight to the outdoors via glazing, and make sure that it's actually transparent vision glazing that you can see through for 70% of the regularly occupied floor area of the space in the building. And then there's a few different criteria that 4 kinds of views. You have to have at least 2 of those for the same amount for the 75%. So it's kind of 2 birds, 1 stone there. You need to see out, and what you're looking at needs to include 2 of these things. So how you do that is on plan. So this is from the reference guide as well. So you pick a point and you just basically draw lines to the edges, and that is your view from those different points. And then you calculate make sure the area meets the 75%, or it adds up to total 75% of the regularly occupied floor area, isn't it? Regularly occupied floor area, yeah. So the other, so just to look at this particular one, where you're basically drawing lines from all the windows out, and you're seeing to what you are actually looking at, because the criteria then from different views: do you have multiple lines of sight? Are you looking at flora or fauna? Are you looking at potential movement? Are you looking at objects 7.5 meters from the exterior, and therefore are you compliant to meet 2 of the criteria? So it's a handy little table to look at that. So that yeah, it's kind of an overlay exercise on the plan then, and this kind of table to see if you can get the points for that, and you will get yeah, 1 or 2 you can evaluate then if you are getting the points here. Oh yeah, this is also a handy table where you can, the 75%, you can what the minimum compliant area would be, what that equates to essentially. So you can do a comparison there as you add up all of your totals. And then for the minimum energy performance, again, this is asking for a whole building energy simulation in the first option, so not requiring you to do that. So you'd either look at your BER cert or your building regs energy calculations to see what your percentage improvement is, to get to just have a look at that. If that's not something that you have done yet or you have access to, well then I would look at the prescriptive compliance. So these are measures that you need to comply with. They're all should be available on the library. I'll actually make sure that I put them up if you let me know when you're getting to it which ones you need, because I can have access to those if you don't already. So that's a tick box thing, the measures and the principles and the codes that you need to approve with. So it's kind of either one or other of those options, depending on how far along your building project will be, or an estimate of how it might fare in those aspects.